Up until about 3 or 4 years ago, I sort of subscribed to the conventional wisdom, which was that high amounts of carbohydrates were necessary to sustain peak physical performance. Fats, and primarily saturated fats, should be avoided. High amounts of protein were necessary to maintain an anabolic state, etc. A lot of the metabolic parameters in my body were also reflecting that. I had elevated triglycerides, profoundly depressed HDL cholesterol. My waist was, obviously much larger than it should have been. And so basically I was sort of on the fence of metabolic syndrome, and this struck me as problematic.
Right, and when you say simple carbohydrates, what are you talking about?
From a dietary standpoint, I was eating copious amounts of rice and pasta and bread and things like that. Always, quote unquote, carbo loading before these long workouts and immediately refueling with the same thing upon completion of these workouts. Carbohydrates were limited to about 30 grams per day. Protein was limited to about 120 grams per day, and my fat intake made up the remainder. It turned out I was making many of the common mistakes that people make when doing that.
So when you say horrible, sorry, what does that mean?
Well, I was very lightheaded. My performance athletically took a huge turn for the worse. I just didn't feel well.
What kind of sports?
Cycling, swimming, high-intensity weight training, that sort of thing. I sort of found myself in a no man's land, which is carbohydrates were reduced to the point where, I probably didn't have enough glucose to keep my brain entirely happy, but through these high levels of protein, I wasn't quite allowing my liver to make enough of, the beta-hydroxybutyrate and other things like that my brain would need to offset its deficiency of glucose. And my body has become so metabolically flexible at accessing fat stores that I really require very little supplemental substrate for glucose production. Jeff and Steve have written a wonderful book called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living, and I think it's an appropriate title because there's a lot of science that supports this, but ultimately we're still in the early stages of understanding how to apply this diet to people in the 21st century. And that's where there's just a little bit of art to it. And there are others for whom it just doesn't seem to work that well. It doesn't offer enough of an advantage over just a well-formulated low-carbohydrate diet. And for those people, I just don't think it makes sense. So really, customization and personalization matters more than anything. Within the athletic sphere, athletes who are primarily aerobic tend to do better. Athletes who are primarily anaerobic don't tend to do as well.